The gun was already pressed against John Shepard's temple when Minnie Ralston finally understood the depth of the trap she had walked into. She stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek saloon, her chest heaving, her green eyes wide with a terror so pure it had stripped away every other feeling she had ever known. The man holding the gun was not a stranger. He was Clement Dre, the man she had agreed to marry just 6 months ago, the man whose letters had been so beautiful and so full of carefully constructed lies that she had packed her entire life into 2 leather trunks and taken a train from Boston all the way to the blistering edge of New Mexico territory. Clement had one thick arm locked around John's throat, the revolver pressed hard against the side of John's skull, and John was completely still. Not still the way a frightened man goes still. Still the way a man goes still when he has made a decision and is waiting for the exact right moment to act on it. His dark eyes found Minnie's across the smoky room, and what she saw in them was not fear. It was a warning. "Come all the way in, darling," Clement said, his voice carrying the slow warmth of a man who believed he had already won. "Close the door behind you." Minnie could not make her legs move. 3 months. It had been 3 months since she had arrived in Dusty Creek, New Mexico, in the blazing July of 1882. 3 months since she had stepped off the stage and known immediately, with a sickening certainty that had dropped through her like cold stone, that something was profoundly wrong. 3 months since John Shepard had been the one to meet her at the stage station, and instead of escorting her to a wedding, he had saved her life. And now, because of her, his life hung by the thinnest possible thread. Minnie. John's voice was measured, calm, almost impossibly so given the circumstances. "Do exactly what I say." "Shut your mouth," Clement said, pressing the gun harder, and John went quiet, but his eyes never left Minnie's face. They were dark brown, almost black in this light, and they had always told her more than his words did, which was saying something, because John Shepard, when he finally chose to speak, could take a woman apart with a single sentence. She had not expected to fall in love with him. That was the honest truth of it. She had not expected any of this. She let the door swing closed behind her, and the latch caught with a sound like a rifle shot in the silence of the saloon. And then she made herself breathe, and she started thinking very fast. The first time she had seen John Shepard was on the 5th of July, 1882, the day after Independence Day, when the whole of Dusty Creek still smelled faintly of gunpowder from the previous night's celebrations. The stagecoach from Santa Fe had been late by nearly 4 hours, which had given Minnie a great deal of time to sit inside the sweltering coach and think very carefully about the choices that had led her here. She was 23 years old. She had been a school teacher in Boston, living in rooms above a hat shop on Marlborough Street, sending half her wages home to her mother and younger sister in Providence. She had answered Clement Dre's advertisement in the Boston Matrimonial Register, not because she was desperate, but because she had calculated, with the same clear-eyed practicality she applied to everything, that her options in Boston were narrowing rapidly. The man in the advertisement had described himself as a prosperous rancher of good moral character, age 35, seeking a refined and educated woman to share in the building of something lasting in the territory of New Mexico. The letters had been extraordinary. They had been warm and thoughtful and tinged with a loneliness that felt genuine. They had described the landscape of New Mexico with such tenderness that Minnie had sometimes sat reading them in her cold, narrow room above the hat shop and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. She had exchanged 12 letters with Clement Dre before she had agreed to come. She had been careful. She had asked precise questions. She had not been a fool, or so she had believed. The coach had lurched to a stop in a cloud of orange dust, and the door had been pulled open from outside, and the hand that reached in to help her down had belonged not to any man she recognized from description, but to someone else entirely. He was tall, considerably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that suggested a life of physical work done without complaint, and his face was tanned to the color of old leather, with dark eyes under a straight brow and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who had run out of patience for decoration. He wore a plain canvas shirt, dark trousers and boots that had seen considerable mileage, and a battered hat that he swept off his head the moment he helped her to the ground, which struck her immediately as a small, unconscious act of courtesy. "Miss Ralston," he said. "Yes," she said, smoothing her traveling dress and looking past him for any sign of Clement Dre. "I'm John Shepard. I'm the deputy sheriff here in Dusty Creek." He turned the hat in his hands once, and she noticed that his hands were very steady. "I'm afraid I have some news that isn't what you were hoping to hear." Minnie went still. "What kind of news?" He looked at her directly, which she appreciated. She had always found it insulting when men looked slightly to the side of her face when delivering difficult information, as though they could not bear to witness the impact of their own words. "Clement Dre isn't here to meet you," John said. "He sent word this morning that he was detained at his ranch. He'd like you to settle in at Mrs. Holt's boarding house and he'll come to you in 3 days." Something in the way he said the word detained snagged her attention. Not the word itself, but the slight compression of his mouth around it, as though it was a word he had chosen carefully instead of the more accurate one. "And what detained him?" she asked. John Shepard looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Business," he said, and put his hat back on. She let it go. She was tired from 3 days of travel, and it was 100 degrees and she had no leverage yet. You gathered information before you acted. That was the first principle of practical living. Mrs. Holt's boarding house was a wide adobe structure on the main street of Dusty Creek, shaded by 2 ancient cottonwood trees, and run by a formidably competent woman of about 50 who spoke to Minnie as though she were an intelligent adult, which immediately endeared her to Minnie completely. Her room was small and clean, and from her window she could see the whole length of the main street, including the sheriff's office directly across. She watched John Shepard go in and out of that office 3 times the first afternoon, and she told herself she was not watching him specifically. She was simply observing the dynamics of the town, which was what a careful woman did when she arrived somewhere new. On the second day, Clement Dre had still not appeared, and Minnie had begun asking questions of her own. She went to the general store, which was run by a garrulous man named Pritchard who clearly found silence unbearable. She bought a small notebook and 2 pencils and a jar of lemon drops, and while Pritchard wrapped her purchases, she said, conversationally, "Mr. Dre's ranch must be quite large if it keeps him so occupied." Pritchard's hand slowed almost imperceptibly. "Oh, it's sizable," he said, "and he's been established here long." 4-5 years, Pritchard said, and then, as though he couldn't quite stop himself, though not without controversy, she waited. Silence was the most productive tool in existence. "Nothing for a lady to concern herself with," Pritchard said, and finished wrapping her purchases with unnecessary speed, and that told her everything she needed to know about the shape of what she didn't yet know. She returned to the boarding house and sat at the small desk in her room and wrote very precise notes in her new notebook, organized by what she had observed, what she had inferred, and what she needed to discover. She was a school teacher. She organized information. It was what she did. She did not see John Shepard that evening, but she could see the light burning in the sheriff's office until very late, and she found herself wondering what he was working on, and she put that thought aside firmly, because she had enough complications without adding more. On the morning of the 3rd day, she had a visitor she had not expected. The woman who came to the boarding house was perhaps 40, with a weathered face and dark eyes and an Apache blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the heat. Mrs. Holt showed her to Minnie's room without explanation, and the woman stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Minnie with an expression that was neither hostile nor friendly but entirely evaluating. "You are the woman Dre sent for," she said. "I am," Minnie said. "Please sit down." The woman did not sit. "My name is Lucinda Velez. My sister was also sent for by Clement Dre 3 years ago." Minnie felt the cold drop through her again. She kept her face very still. "What happened to your sister?" She married him, Lucinda said. 2 months after she arrived, she was dead. The silence in the small room was absolute. Outside, a horse went by on the street, its hooves slow and deliberate in the heat. How, Minnie said. They said she fell from her horse. She did not ride horses. She was afraid of them since childhood. Lucinda held Minnie's gaze. I could not prove anything. The sheriff at the time was a man named Croft. He was Dre's man. But the new deputy, the one who came last year, he has been looking, asking questions. John Shepard, Minnie said. Lucinda's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been approval. He cannot move without evidence. Dre has money and influence and 3 men who will swear to anything he tells them. But if Dre's new intended wife was to disappear before the wedding, he would have no reason to hurt anyone. Minnie looked at the woman for a long moment. You're telling me to run. I'm telling you, Lucinda said carefully, that you have a choice. Not everyone who comes here has one. After Lucinda left, Minnie sat for a very long time in the hot, quiet room. She thought about her sister in Providence, who was 17 and needed the money Minnie had been promised as part of the marriage arrangement. She thought about Clement Dre's letters, which she took out and read again with entirely different eyes, and which now struck her as a document of extraordinary calculating manipulation. She thought about a woman who had been afraid of horses dying in a fall from one. Then she thought, with a clarity that surprised even herself, that she was not going to run. She was going to do something much more dangerous. She was going to stay and find the evidence that John Shepard needed. She did not know yet that in making that decision, she had also decided something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the way a man could look at a woman across a dusty street and make her feel, for the first time in 23 years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She went to the sheriff's office that afternoon. John was alone. The sheriff himself, a man named Briggs who was somewhere between complicit and simply exhausted, was apparently at the barber. John looked up when she came in and she registered that he did not seem surprised to see her, which told her that he had been expecting something like this, though perhaps not exactly this. I know about Dre's first wife, she said, and sat down across from his desk without being invited, which she could see briefly startled him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Lucinda Velez. Yes. He studied her face for a while. The afternoon light was coming through the single window, and it caught the angles of his face, and she thought, irrelevantly, that he was a very serious-looking man, and that serious-looking men had always interested her more than they perhaps should have. Miss Ralston, he said, I need you to understand the situation you're in with some precision. I think I understand it tolerably well, she said. Clement Dre is a man who advertises for educated women of good family, marries them for access to whatever money or property or connections they might possess, and then removes them when they are no longer useful. Your predecessor failed to pursue it because he was in Dre's pocket. You've been building a case, but you lack direct evidence. I've arrived in Dusty Creek, and I represent both a potential victim and, if I'm willing to cooperate, a potential source of that evidence. John Shepard looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not disbelief exactly. It was more like a man recalibrating. That's essentially correct, he said. Then we should make a plan, she said. They talked for 2 hours. She told him exactly what was in Dre's letters, and he listened to every word with complete attention and asked precise questions. And she found that there was something enormously satisfying about talking to a man who listened as though every word you said carried weight. He explained what he had gathered so far, which was circumstantial and largely inadmissible. Testimony from a ranch hand named Tomas who had since left the territory, a letter from Lucinda's sister that had been found after the woman's death, and financial records suggesting that Dre had received a substantial payment from an insurance arrangement following his wife's death that no one had fully investigated. He needed something direct. He needed either a witness to something criminal or a document or a confession. I'll meet him, Minnie said. I'll go to the ranch and I'll keep my eyes open and I'll tell you everything I see." "That's not something I'm comfortable asking you to do," John said. "I'm not asking for your comfort," she said pleasantly. "I'm asking for your cooperation." He looked at her for a long moment and she thought she saw something move through his expression that was not entirely professional. Then he said, "If you're going to do this, there have to be conditions." "Name them." "You don't go anywhere on that property without telling me first where you'll be. You come to me every 2 days with whatever you've seen. You carry this." He opened his desk drawer and produced a small, pearl-handled derringer. "Do you know how to use a firearm?" "My father was a sporting man," she said, and took the derringer and checked it with a competence that made John Shepard blink. "And if anything feels wrong," he said, "anything at all, you get out immediately. You don't wait to gather more information. You get out." "Agreed," she said, and they shook hands across the desk, and she felt the warmth of his hand around hers and the steadiness of it, and she was careful to let go at exactly the right moment and not a beat later. She met Clement Dre the following morning. He arrived at the boarding house in a clean suit and a hat that had cost real money, and he was exactly as handsome as his letters had suggested, which she had half expected to be a lie, but turned out to be true. He was a large, good-looking man with pale blue eyes and excellent teeth, and a manner that was so convincingly warm and attentive that she understood immediately how he had deceived women who had not been warned in advance. She smiled at him and shook his hand and let him take her to lunch at the town's one acceptable restaurant, and she listened to him with every appearance of delight while simultaneously cataloging everything he said for inconsistencies. There were several. He said he had been a rancher for 8 years in New Mexico, but Pritchard had said 5. He said his previous marriage had ended in grief, which was true in the most technical sense, but when she asked gently what his wife had been like, his answer was oddly general, as though describing a type rather than a person. He said his ranch was currently producing well and expanding, but when she asked about specific crops or stock, his fluency became slightly blurred at the edges. He was a man who had constructed a character and inhabited it with considerable skill, but the character was not built on solid ground, and the cracks showed if you knew where to look. That evening she slipped across the street to the sheriff's office after dark and told John everything, sitting in the same chair across from his desk while he wrote notes in a neat, efficient hand that she found herself studying when she thought he wasn't looking. "He's careful," John said. "He won't give you anything outright." "No," she said, "but there's something at the ranch." He mentioned it twice without meaning to and then redirected both times. Something about a locked room in the main house. John looked up. His first wife kept a correspondence with her family. Letters that Lucinda says were never returned to them after the death. If those letters are in that locked room and they document anything about her state of mind or her fears, then that's what I need to find, Minnie said. Minnie. He had started using her first name somewhere in the second day without either of them commenting on it. "This is becoming more dangerous than I initially." "I know," she said. "I'm not stopping." He sat back and looked at her with that expression she was becoming familiar with, the one that was professional concern layered over something else that neither of them had named yet. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met," he said, with no inflection that suggested it was a complaint. "I have been told that," she said, "by men who said it as a criticism and were entirely wrong about it." Something that might have been a smile moved briefly across his face. It transformed him considerably, and she filed that away with everything else. She had agreed to ride out to the Dre ranch with Clement in 2 days' time, to see it and give it her formal approval before the arrangements were finalized. She spent the intervening day at the boarding house, outwardly reading and sewing like a perfectly ordinary waiting woman, and inwardly planning with the methodical focus of a general before a campaign. She also, during those 2 days, had 3 more conversations with John Shepard that had nothing to do with Clement Dre. The first happened because she came across him at the well behind the main street at dusk, filling a bucket, and they had simply started talking and did not stop for an hour. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, that he had come west at 20 after his father died and left the family farm to debts rather than sons, that he had worked cattle drives for 4 years before becoming a lawman in a small Kansas town and eventually making his way here. He was 27 years old. He had been in Dusty Creek for 14 months. He asked about Boston, and she told him honestly about the hat shop and the cold rooms and the students who came to her classroom with such desperate earnestness that she had sometimes felt her heart might split with the weight of how much she wanted to give them. He listened with that complete attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was, not a performance but a fundamental quality of his character. The second conversation happened the following morning when she found him at the livery stable, and he was teaching a young Mexican boy of perhaps 10 how to properly tie a lead rope, with infinite patience, explaining each step twice and letting the boy do it himself 3 times before he was satisfied. He had not seen her watching. She had not announced herself. The third conversation was the one that changed everything. It was late on the second evening, past 9 o'clock, and she had come to the office because she couldn't sleep, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that it was not entirely about the case. He was at his desk reading by lamplight, and he looked up when she came in, and she saw him register the fact that she was not there on business, and he didn't say anything about it. He simply stood and offered her the better chair, which he had never done before. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into the chair and folding her hands in her lap. "About the ranch," he said. "About what I'm doing here," she corrected. "All of it, not just the plan." He sat down again and set his book aside, and the lamplight was warm and the night outside was full of cricket sounds and the distant cry of something wild and far away. "And," he said. "I came here," she said slowly, "because I had calculated that I was out of options, and I think that was honest, but it was also incomplete. I think I came here because I was tired of a life that was entirely constructed of obligation and practicality and nothing else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would the something else look like?" She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily. "I don't know yet," she said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. He nodded slowly. "I came here," he said, "for similar reasons. Not obligation exactly, but a sense that wherever I was passing through rather than arriving. I kept thinking the next place would be the one where that feeling stopped." "And has it stopped?" she asked. "Here." He looked at her with a directness that made her breath change. "In the last few days," he said carefully, "it has considerably slowed." Neither of them said anything else about it that night. But something had shifted between them as irrevocably as landscape shifts after a flood, different banks, different channel, the same water but running in a new direction. And they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it because there was a dangerous man to deal with first, and some things had to wait. She went to the Dray Ranch on the following morning, riding in Clement's buckboard with a carpetbag of belongings and the Derringer at the bottom of it under her spare chemise. The ranch was large and impressive-looking, with a whitewashed main house and 2 long bunkhouses and corrals full of horses, and a crew of men who watched her arrival with expressions she carefully did not react to. Clement showed her around with proprietary pride, pointing out the kitchen garden and the smokehouse, and the well and the view from the front porch across miles of scrubland, to a line of red mesas that she could not help finding genuinely beautiful. She asked interested questions and touched things with apparent admiration, and observed everything with absolute precision. She found the locked room on the second day. It was in the north wing of the main house, off a hallway that Clement had shown her briefly and then steered her firmly away from. The door was heavy wood with a brass padlock that was newer than anything else in the house, which told her it had been added specifically to keep something in or someone out. She needed a key or a hairpin and enough time alone. She had the hairpin. She needed the time. On the morning of the third day, she told Clement she wished to write some letters and would need the afternoon undisturbed. He agreed with the indulgent certainty of a man who believed he had already won. She waited until she could hear him in the yard, talking loudly to one of his men about the condition of the south fences, and then she went to the locked room and worked on the padlock with the hairpin for nearly 8 agonizing minutes before it gave. The room was a small study. There was a desk and a bookcase and a trunk, and the trunk was unlocked, and inside it was what she had come for. There were perhaps 30 letters, tied with a piece of string, written in a woman's careful script on paper that was beginning to yellow. Maria Velez Dre, writing to her family in Santa Fe over a period of 8 months. Minnie sat on the floor of the locked room in the dusty afternoon light and read everyone. They began hopefully and grew progressively more frightened. Maria described a husband who was kind in company and cold at home, who controlled access to money, who had taken possession of the small inheritance she had brought from her family within a month of the marriage. She described arguments and silences, and a growing fear she could not quite name. The last letter, which was dated 12 days before her death, said only, "I am afraid. I have found papers that he does not know I have found. I do not know what to do. Please send someone." Minnie's hands were shaking slightly when she finished reading. She was not a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were burning. She replaced the letters exactly as she had found them, relocked the room, and 2 hours later excused herself from dinner early, claiming a headache. She lay in the guest room until the house went quiet, and then she dressed in dark clothes and went out the window and found the horse she had been allowed to ride in the paddock near the house, and she was 3 miles down the road to Dusty Creek before anyone might have noticed she was gone. John was still in the office. She could see the light from the road. She came in without knocking, and he took one look at her face and stood up. She told him everything. She described the room and the trunk and the letters in detail precise enough that he could document it. He wrote as she spoke, fast and clean. When she finished, they sat in silence for a moment. "That's enough," he said. "With Lucinda's testimony and the financial records and what you just described, it's enough to get a warrant and a proper investigation. If those letters are still in that room, they're the evidence we need." "They are," she said. "I left them exactly as I found them." He looked at her across the desk, and the lamplight was between them, and he said very quietly, "Are you all right?" She thought about Maria Dre, who had been afraid and had written letters that had not reached anyone in time. She thought about what might have happened to herself if she had simply arrived in Dusty Creek without having been warned. "I will be," she said, and meant it. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he said, "I'll wire the territorial marshal tonight. We'll have men here within a week. In the meantime, you should not go back to that ranch. Dre will know something is wrong if I simply disappear," she said. "I'll handle Dre," John said, with a quietness that was more absolute than any raised voice. She stayed at Mrs. Holt's boarding house. She sent Clement Dre a note claiming a sudden illness and the need for more time in town before committing to a final arrangement. He wrote back with smooth patience, and she could feel the calculation behind the words as clearly as she could feel the desert heat coming through the walls of her room. The week while they waited for the marshal was the strangest week of Minnie's life, because it was a week of genuine danger and genuine waiting. And in between those twin realities, something between herself and John Shepard was growing with a speed and inevitability that she had stopped trying to regulate. He brought her meals from the restaurant twice, because he said he was going anyway, and it was no trouble. And they ate together at the small table in the boarding house parlor, and talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have somehow skipped the awkward preliminary stages, and gone directly to the kind of conversation that normally takes years to arrive at. She found out that he had read extensively and had opinions about things she had strong opinions about herself, and that they disagreed on a number of matters with a heated enjoyment that she recognized as the particular pleasure of being argued with by someone whose intelligence you respected. She found out that he had not been in love before, which surprised her, and then did not surprise her, because he was a man who would not do something halfway, and perhaps he had simply not yet encountered something worth doing all the way. She found out that he was fundamentally lonely in the way that very self-contained people are lonely. Not dramatically, not obviously, but with a persistent low-level ache that they have usually arranged not to think about. She told him about her mother and her sister and the hat shop, and about the students she had taught, and about a particular afternoon in her classroom when a girl of 9 named Florence Marsh had suddenly, and without warning, recited a long poem from memory that she had taught herself in secret. And the absolute joy on that child's face had been one of the most beautiful things Minnie had ever seen. She told him that she had wanted children of her own for as long as she could remember. He was very quiet for a moment when she said that, and then he said, "That seems like something that should happen." And his voice was different when he said it, different from the way his voice was when he was being careful. On the 5th day, Clement Dre came to town. He was polite and controlled, but the patience in him had shifted, and there was something underneath the politeness now that was harder and less generous. He took Minnie to lunch and spent the meal persuading her very skillfully that it was time to finalize their arrangements, and she smiled and deflected and promised to give him an answer within 2 days, and then she went directly to John and told him that the situation was accelerating. "The marshal should be here tomorrow," John said. "I need you to stay in the boarding house until then." "He's suspicious," she said. "He won't wait 2 days." "1 day," John said. "Can you give me 1 day?" She looked at him. He was concerned in a way that went beyond professional duty, and they both knew it. "1 day," she said. The marshal did not come the next day. He sent a wire instead, delayed by a situation in Las Cruces, arriving in 3 days. 3 days. Clement Dre arrived at the boarding house that same evening with a smile like a door closing, and told Minnie that he had made arrangements for the wedding and that he needed her answer that night. She held his gaze and said that she needed to pray on the matter and would send word in the morning. And the moment he left, she went across the street to John, and they stood in the office and looked at each other, and the situation between them was clear and not good. "I can arrest him," John said. "But without the territorial marshal's authority to back it up, Briggs will release him on Dre's word alone, and then we lose everything. Dre destroys the letters and we have nothing. So we need to keep him occupied and not suspicious for 3 more days," Minnie said. "Or," John said, and he stopped. "Or," she said. "Or I go to the ranch tonight and get those letters," he said. "If I have them in hand, I can arrest him with or without the marshal, and the evidence is secure." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is breaking and entering," she said. "I know," he said. "John," she said his name with a weight that stopped him. "If something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," he said, with the same calm certainty that she had come to recognize as his particular form of stubbornness. She wanted to argue further, but she could see by the set of his jaw that the decision was made, and arguing further would only delay him and accomplish nothing except possibly allowing her to feel better about her own objections. "Be careful," she said, and then, before she could think better of it, she reached up and briefly, without any particular calculation, touched his face. Her fingertips against his jaw just for a moment. He went completely still. Then his hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his face, and he held it there for a few seconds, and his eyes were very dark and very steady and full of something she recognized, because she was full of it too. Then he gently lowered her hand and held it for 1 more second, and let go, and went out the door, and she stood in the empty office with her heart beating unusually hard and thought with perfect clarity that whatever happened next, something between them had been settled. He was back before midnight, but not with what she had hoped. He had arrived at the ranch to find the locked room open and empty. Clement Dre had moved the letters. Either he had suspected something, or he simply moved them regularly as a precaution, but they were gone from the trunk and the room showed signs of having been recently and hastily searched. "He knows something is wrong," John said, and his voice was tight in a way she had not heard before. "Then we need to move tonight," she said. "I can't arrest him without—" "Not arrest him," she said. "Get Lucinda. She knows other things. She knows people who knew Maria. If we have sworn statements from enough people before the marshal arrives, we don't need the letters." John looked at her with an expression that was complicated and then nodded. "Lucinda lives 2 miles outside of town," he said. "I'll go now." "I'm coming with you," she said. He started to object, and she simply walked past him to the door, and after a beat she heard him follow, and she felt a brief rush of warmth that she filed away for later. Lucinda Velez was awake when they arrived. She was a woman who slept lightly, she said, and had for 3 years. She sat with them at her table and told them everything she knew, every detail of every conversation she had had with her sister, every observation of Clement Dre's behavior, every instance of manipulation and control she had witnessed. John wrote all of it down, and she signed the statement with a steady hand. "There is also," Lucinda said, "a man named Torres. He was Dre's foreman 3 years ago. He left the ranch the week Maria died. He lives in Las Cruces now." She paused. He saw what happened. The silence in the small adobe house was very complete. "He was afraid," Lucinda said. "He has been afraid for 3 years, but if you asked him with sufficient authority, I believe he would speak." "The marshal is coming from Las Cruces," John said slowly. "Then perhaps," Lucinda said, "someone should speak to the marshal before he makes the journey." John sent a wire to Las Cruces the next morning before dawn, addressed to the territorial marshal with a request that he locate and interview one Eduardo Torres on the matter of the Dre investigation before departing for Dusty Creek. By noon, a wire had come back confirming that Torres had been found and was talking. By mid-afternoon, Clement Dre had apparently received word of his own, because that was when things broke open. It started with one of Dre's men, a large, brutal-looking individual named Scarnes, who came to the boarding house looking for Minnie, and was turned away by Mrs. Holt with a manner that suggested she had sent away far more formidable visitors in her time. Minnie watched from the window of her room as Scarnes went directly to the saloon and sent a boy running to the ranch, and she understood that the endgame had begun. She went to John immediately. He had already seen Scarnes and was standing in his office with his hand on his gun belt, thinking. "He's going to run," John said, "or he's going to do something worse. Those are the 2 options for a man like this when the trap closes." "Which do you think?" she said. He looked at her. "A man like Dre doesn't run. He consolidates. He finds leverage." She understood what he meant the moment he said it, and the cold came back. She was the leverage. They were still standing in the office when the door opened behind her, and it was not Dre himself but 2 of his men, and they were very large and they were armed, and one of them said that Mr. Dre would like a word with both of them at the saloon, and the way he said it removed all possibility that this was an invitation that could be declined. They walked across the street to the saloon with a man on each side of them, and the saloon was otherwise empty at this hour, swept out and smelling of yesterday's whiskey, and Clement Dre was standing at the bar with a whiskey he was not drinking, and he looked at both of them with the pleasant expression of a man who has decided to be done being patient. And behind him, one more man had emerged from the back of the room, and he had John, who had somehow become separated from her in the doorway, and the gun was at John's temple, and Minnie was standing in the doorway understanding the trap with perfect, terrible clarity. That was the moment where this story began. That was the moment she stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek Saloon on the 1st of October, 1882, and saw the man she loved with a gun pressed to his head, and understood that this was the forced choice Clement Dre had constructed for her. "It's very simple," Clement said, setting his untouched whiskey on the bar with a click that was unnaturally loud. "You are going to sign some papers for me. You're going to tell the territorial marshal when he arrives that everything here is perfectly in order and that you are happy and that the investigation is based on a misunderstanding. And then you are going to marry me and come to the ranch and stop causing trouble." "And if I don't?" Minnie said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was proud of it. "Then your deputy friend here has an accident," Clement said. "The territory is full of accidents, you know that. Maria certainly found that out." He said his first wife's name without any particular feeling, and that absence of feeling was the most damning thing she had ever heard. She looked at John across the room. His eyes were on her face. She could read him now, she realized, with a fluency she had not had 3 months ago. He was telling her not to agree. He was telling her to hold. She also registered, because she had not spent 3 months watching a deputy sheriff for nothing, that John's right hand was at his side and not quite as still as the rest of him. She needed to keep Clement Dre's eyes on her. "All right," she said. "I'll sign whatever you want." She took one step forward into the room. "But I want to understand something first." Clement watched her. The man holding John shifted his weight slightly, bringing the gun more centrally against John's skull, which meant his grip on John's arm had adjusted. "What do you want to understand?" Clement said, with the magnanimity of a man who believes he has already won. "Maria," Minnie said, "was she afraid of you?" At the end, she saw it flicker in his pale blue eyes. Just for a moment, something real underneath the construction. Something cold and flat that told her more than any document or testimony could. "Maria was troubled," he said. "She was afraid," Minnie said, and her voice was very quiet. "She wrote to her family and said she was afraid. And you found those letters and you knew she knew, and you—" "That is enough," Clement said, and his voice had changed. And he turned to look at his man with the gun, and in that fraction of a second John moved. It was not a dramatic movement. It was a precise and very fast one. He dropped his weight suddenly, pulling the man's gun arm down with him, and his right hand came up with his own revolver from the hip holster, and the shot was loud in the empty saloon, and the gun at his head discharged into the ceiling and sent dust raining down, and then there was a confusion of shouting and movement. Minnie had the derringer out of her sleeve before Clement Dre had finished turning back toward her. She had put it there that morning because she had learned in the past 3 months to be prepared. "Don't," she said. Clement Dre stopped. He looked at the small pearl-handled gun in her perfectly steady hands, and he stopped. John had his man disarmed and on the floor. The other 2 men, Scarnes and his companion, had apparently not anticipated this level of resistance from a schoolteacher and a deputy, because they had the unhelpful instinct of cowards, which is to look toward the leader for instruction, and the leader was looking down the barrel of a derringer. "Clement Dre," John said from across the room, his voice the calmest sound in the world, "you are under arrest." It was over, and it was not over. The territorial marshal arrived the following morning with 3 deputies and Eduardo Torres, who had been Maria Dre's foreman, and had witnessed Clement Dre in a violent rage the night before Maria's death, and who had lived for 3 years with the weight of not having spoken. He was a small, tired man with haunted eyes, and he testified with a shaking voice, and a relief so profound that it was like watching something imprisoned walk finally into open air. Clement Dre was taken to Santa Fe in custody, and the case was thorough and well documented, and Lucinda Velez was present for all of it, and she sat through the proceedings with a stillness that was not grief but something harder and more enduring, and when it was finished, she found Minnie in the corridor of the territorial courthouse and took her hands without saying anything, which was its own kind of eloquence. Minnie stayed in Dusty Creek. She had not specifically planned to. She had thought in the abstract that she would return to Boston once the immediate situation was resolved. She had her trunks at Mrs. Holt's boarding house. She had letters from her mother asking when she was coming home. She had, technically, nothing keeping her here. But there was John. They had not spoken directly about what existed between them in the immediate aftermath of Dre's arrest. There was too much to attend to. Statements and warrants and the logistics of the prisoner's transfer and the matter of Dre's ranch hands, most of whom had simply been hired men who knew nothing, and the restoration of Maria Velez Dre's letters to her family, which was accomplished through the marshal's office, and which Lucinda received with a dry-eyed dignity that Minnie would not forget. It was 10 days after the arrest before the air between herself and John felt like something other than the aftermath of crisis. They were sitting on the front porch of the boarding house in the evening, which had become, at some point, a regular occurrence, and the sky was doing what New Mexico skies did at dusk, which was become so extraordinarily colored that it seemed almost impolite to look at it, all rose and copper and a deep, impossible violet along the mesas. "I've had a letter from the school board," Minnie said. "Apparently the town doesn't have a school or a teacher, and someone told them about me." John looked at her. "Who told them about you?" "Mrs. Holt," she said, which was probably true because Mrs. Holt had opinions about the deficiencies of Dusty Creek and the means to correct them. "And," he said, "and they've offered me a position," she said, "starting in January." He was quiet for a moment. The sky was deepening toward purple and the first stars were appearing. "Are you considering it?" he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, but his attention was entirely on her answer. She could feel it. "I'm very much considering it," she said, "though I have some questions about the situation, such as whether it would make sense practically for a schoolteacher to set up a small house of her own, or whether there might be a more sensible arrangement." She kept her voice precise and neutral and watched him with everything she had. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, all that careful control set aside, and what was underneath it was something that made her chest feel as though it might be too small for its contents. "Minnie," he said. "Yes." She said. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "to find the right time to say this for approximately 6 weeks, and I have concluded that there is no right time and I am simply going to say it." "Please do," she said. "I love you," he said, plainly and without elaboration. "I didn't expect to. I didn't look for it. But somewhere between the first afternoon and now, it happened, and I think it was probably inevitable from about the 4th conversation, if I'm being honest, and I am trying to be honest." She felt the warmth of it move through her from somewhere in the center of her chest outward, to her fingertips. "I love you too," she said, with the same plainness, because she was not a woman who decorated things that did not need decoration. "I have for some time." He exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath. Then he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and held it, and they both looked at the New Mexico sky going from violet to deep indigo, and it was one of the finest moments of her life. They were engaged by November, and married on the 14th of December, 1882, in the small whitewashed church at the edge of Dusty Creek, which was just large enough to hold the town's population and Mrs. Holt's flowers. Lucinda Velez came from her place 2 miles out and stood in the front row with an expression of measured approval that was more meaningful to Minnie than most people's open delight. The marshal's deputy who had first brought Eduardo Torres in was there, because he had somehow become a regular visitor to Dusty Creek in the intervening weeks. Sheriff Briggs, who had been persuaded that a change in career might be advisable, had submitted his resignation, and John had been made acting sheriff, and then simply sheriff, which suited him in the way that positions suit people who were made for them. Minnie wore a dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Holt had helped her make from fabric ordered from Santa Fe, and she carried dried desert flowers because it was December and that was what was available, and she thought they were more beautiful than hothouse roses, which she said to John at the altar in a whisper that made him smile in the way she had come to love best, the real one that he didn't quite manage to suppress. He said his vows with the same steadiness and directness with which he did everything, looking at her face the entire time, and she said hers with a precision that she knew would have made anyone who thought wedding vows were merely ceremonial look twice, because she meant every word with a literalness that she intended him to understand. They had a small celebration at Mrs. Holt's boarding house with the town and a table of food that Dusty Creek's several capable cooks had contributed, and someone had a fiddle, and someone else had a guitar, and the music was lively, and the night was cold and bright, and Minnie danced with John for the first time and discovered that he danced well, which she had not expected, and when she said so, he told her with great dignity that his mother had insisted on it. And it was the first time he had mentioned his mother, and she made a note to ask him about her later. They moved into a house on the east end of Dusty Creek that had been available, and was small but solidly built, with a south-facing window that caught the light all morning, and a porch from which you could see the mesas. And it needed work. And they did it together through the weeks of January and February, Minnie painting the interior walls while John repaired the roof and the fence. And in the evenings they sat by the fire and she read aloud while he worked on small tasks with his hands. And this is the kind of life Minnie had not known she was looking for and had found. She started teaching in the converted storeroom that the town had provided as a temporary schoolhouse in January, with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and within 3 weeks, the parents were sending notes home saying their children were speaking in full sentences about books they had read, which Minnie considered a good start. She and John fell into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that occasionally surprised her. She had expected the practical adjustments to be more difficult, the negotiation of space and habit and preference. But John was a person who paid attention, who noticed things and adapted without needing things spelled out, and she was a person who communicated clearly, and those two qualities together meant that the small frictions of shared life were navigated with less drama than she had ever observed in other marriages. There were disagreements. They disagreed about the proper preparation of coffee, which was serious. They disagreed about the management of a particular land dispute between two ranchers that Minnie had strong views about, and John was required by professional necessity to approach with more neutrality than she felt it deserved. They disagreed about whether the stray dog that had appeared at their back door in February was their dog now or a visitor, and the dog settled this argument by simply continuing to be there every morning until the question became moot. They named the dog Santos, after a comment Minnie made about miracles arriving uninvited, which John found funny enough that he laughed out loud, which was still, several months into their marriage, something that happened rarely enough that it was a particular gift when it did. In the spring, Lucinda Velez began coming to the school. She sat with the older students 2 days a week and taught them things that Minnie could not: the names of plants and their uses, the movement of weather across the mesa country, the history of the land before the town. Minnie watched her teach with the children arranged around her in the dust outside the schoolroom, and thought about what knowledge costs when it is not passed on, and put Lucinda's teaching at the center of the curriculum rather than the edge of it. The trial of Clement Dre concluded in March. He was convicted of the murder of Maria Velez Dre on the testimony of Eduardo Torres, and the substantial documentary evidence that the Territorial Marshal's Office had assembled, including financial records showing a pattern of fraud against his wife that predated her death by months. He received a sentence that Minnie thought adequate and Lucinda thought insufficient, and they were both right in different ways, and when Minnie wrote to her mother about it, she framed it as a story of justice that was imperfect but present, which was how she had come to think about most of the systems she encountered in her life. She wrote to her mother often. Her mother wrote back with equal frequency, and the tone of the correspondence shifted over the months from anxious inquiry into her daughter's situation to something that sounded increasingly like pride. Her sister Clara wrote occasional letters that were enthusiastic and somewhat chaotic in their structure, and Minnie treasured them enormously. In June of 1883, she told John that she was expecting their first child. They were in the kitchen after dinner, and she told him with the same directness with which she told him everything, and his response was to sit down at the kitchen table and look at her with an expression that was not composed of any single emotion but of several simultaneously, and she sat down across from him and took his hands across the table. "I didn't say it to alarm you," she said. "I'm not alarmed," he said, and it was slightly not true, and they both knew it, and it was all right. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I didn't know until just now how much I wanted this." "A child," she said. "Specifically," he said, "a child with you." She felt the familiar warmth that was no longer surprising, but was still just as powerful for being familiar. "Well," she said, "now you know." He raised her hands and pressed them briefly to his mouth, which was a gesture she had not seen from him before and which she decided immediately was her favorite thing. The pregnancy was not easy in the way that pregnancies in a desert town with no hospital and the nearest physician 40 miles away are not easy. Minnie was ill through the summer, and the heat was relentless, and she continued teaching until September with a determination that impressed her students and alarmed Mrs. Holt. John was attentive with a competence that did not tip into hovering, which was exactly what she needed, and he rode to Las Cruces to bring back a midwife named Rosario Garcia, who was recommended by 3 separate people as the finest in the territory. Rosario was a compact, energetic woman in her early 50s who immediately took command of the situation with a cheerful authority that Minnie found enormously reassuring. She and Minnie liked each other within 20 minutes, and Rosario stayed in Dusty Creek through the autumn, occupying the spare room at Mrs. Holt's and contributing considerably to the social life of the town. Their son was born on the 3rd of November, 1883, after a long labor that Rosario managed with skill, and John survived by sitting outside the bedroom door and being very still, which was how he managed most things he could not control. Minnie named the boy William, for her grandfather, with a middle name of Thomas, for no reason except that when she saw him, she thought he looked like a Thomas, and time has since confirmed this judgment. He was a solid, loud child with John's dark eyes and Minnie's decisive chin, and he regarded the world from the beginning with the evaluating suspicion of someone who has decided to have opinions about everything, which Minnie found familiar. John held him for the first time with the careful steadiness of a man who understands weight and knows how to hold things without breaking them, and the expression on his face when he looked down at the boy was one of the 2 or 3 images Minnie knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life regardless of what else happened. "Hello, William," John said, very quietly. The boy looked up at him with those dark, evaluating eyes. "He looks skeptical," Minnie said from the bed. "He gets that from you," John said, and she laughed despite her exhaustion, and the sound of it in the room felt like something that belonged there. The town of Dusty Creek grew through 1884 and into 1885, as towns along the railroad route were growing, more families, more commerce, a proper church with a permanent pastor, a second saloon that was considerably more respectable than the first one had been. Minnie's school expanded from 1 room to 2, and she hired a second teacher, a young woman from Denver named Frances Park who was sharp and energetic, and adapted to Dusty Creek's particular rhythms with impressive speed. John's position as sheriff had become foundational to the character of the town, which was not accidental. He was known for a particular quality of fairness that was different from leniency. He was not lenient, but he was precise, and he made the same judgment regardless of whether the person in front of him was wealthy or not, Anglo or Mexican or Apache. And in the complicated social landscape of New Mexico Territory in the 1880s, this was not a small thing. He had conflicts with men who thought his neutrality was itself a political position, and it was, and he did not apologize for it. Minnie was visible in those conflicts, not as a shadow behind him but as herself, a woman with strong views who expressed them in the town council meetings that had been established and which she had attended from their first session. She was not the only woman who attended, but she was the one who spoke most often and with the least apparent interest in what anyone thought about a woman speaking, which either irritated people or impressed them, and often both. In the spring of 1885, Lucinda Velez told Minnie that she had received a proposal of marriage from a widowed sheep rancher from south of town named Agustin Romero, who was kind and quiet and had known her for 2 years, and asked her with a directness and respect that she found, she said, unexpected. "What did you say?" Minnie asked. "I said I needed to think," Lucinda said. "I have been afraid to love anyone since Maria died. I thought it was grief. I think perhaps it was also fear of losing someone else." They were sitting on Minnie's porch in the morning with coffee and William on the ground between them pursuing Santos. With an ambition the dog was resigned to. "Is he a good man?" Minnie asked. Yes, Lucinda said without hesitation. Then I think, Minnie said, that fear is a reason to be careful about how you proceed, not a reason not to proceed at all. Lucinda looked at her for a moment. You were afraid when you came here, she said. I was terrified, Minnie said. Every single day for weeks, and every good thing I have is on the other side of that fear. Lucinda was quiet for a while, watching William and Santos negotiate their relationship. Then she said, I think I will tell him yes. She did in June, and the wedding was a small, beautiful event at Lucinda's place. And Agustin Romero was indeed a good man, quiet and steady, and entirely devoted to the woman standing beside him. And Minnie and John sat together in the outdoor ceremony under a sky of extraordinary blue, and she held his hand and thought about how life bends in directions you cannot plan. By the autumn of 1885, Minnie was expecting their second child, and this time the pregnancy was easier. The summer cooler, Rosario Garcia once again installed in her room at Mrs. Holt's by October and pronouncing everything satisfactory with the authority of a woman who has never in her life been wrong about such matters. Their daughter was born on a cold night in December, 2 years and a few weeks after William, and Minnie had been right about wanting children, had been right about all of it, the way a person is right about a thing that fits who they fundamentally are. They named her Elena Clara, the second name for Minnie's sister, and she was dark-haired and brown-eyed, and from the beginning had a quality of particular attentiveness, as though she was listening to everything and filing it away, which John said she had gotten from her mother and Minnie did not dispute. Clara came from Providence the following spring to meet her niece and nephew, and she stayed for 3 weeks and fell entirely in love with New Mexico territory, and with Dusty Creek, and with, it turned out, the young Deputy John had taken on the previous year, a good-natured, earnest young man from Texas named Peter Cole, which was a development that no one had entirely predicted, and that Minnie observed with the private satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a thing to happen without knowing she was waiting. She said nothing to Clara about Peter except to note once that he was a person of good character, which was enough. Clara was 21 and entirely capable of making her own assessments, which she did, and she wrote to Minnie 3 months after returning to Providence to say that she had received a letter from a deputy in Dusty Creek, New Mexico, and what did Minnie think about that? And Minnie wrote back one sentence, I think you should answer it. Clara moved to Dusty Creek in 1887 and married Peter Cole in the same whitewashed church where Minnie and John had married, and Minnie was her matron of honor, and John gave the toast at the dinner after, which was brief and sincere, and made Clara cry and Peter look proud. And Minnie thought that the territory had been good to her family in ways she could not have calculated when she had packed her 2 trunks in Boston 5 years before, and boarded the train with careful plans and a letter full of lies. Santos the dog lived to be quite old, by the standards of dogs, and died peacefully in the winter of 1888 in his preferred spot near the kitchen stove. And William was 5 and was sad about it with the seriousness of a child who feels things completely. And John talked to him about loss with the same directness and care with which he talked to William about everything. And Minnie listened from the next room and thought about what kind of father her husband was, and felt the same quiet amazement she often felt that she had arrived here, specifically here, to this particular life. They buried Santos near the fence line at the back of the yard, and William put a flat stone on the grave and painted Santos on it with meticulous care. And this small ceremony told Minnie something important about the boy she was raising, that he understood the value of marking things. The school continued to grow. By 1888, there were 3 rooms and 4 teachers and students who were arriving from outside Dusty Creek, because the school's reputation had traveled, which was gratifying and also created logistical challenges that Minnie addressed with her customary systematic efficiency. She wrote to the Territorial Education Office 3 times requesting formal recognition and funding, and on the third letter, she received a response that was both promising and full of bureaucratic conditions, which she addressed condition by condition over the following months with the persistence of someone who has never been deterred by institutional friction. John, in the same years, had dealt with the kinds of situations that came to the sheriff of a growing town: land disputes and theft, and the occasional violence that the territory had not yet entirely outgrown, and he dealt with them with the same consistent character that was both his professional quality and simply who he was. He had occasion once, in the summer of 1887, to face down 3 armed men who had come to Dusty Creek with the explicit intention of causing significant harm, and he did so in the main street in a situation that Minnie only knew the full details of after the fact, because he had, she understood, been protecting her from worry in the moment, which she forgave him for imperfectly for several days before deciding that some forms of protection were not objectionable. "You could have been killed," she said. "I wasn't," he said. "That is an incomplete argument," she said. "I know," he said. "I was careful, John." He looked at her with those dark eyes that she could read so completely now, and what she saw in them was everything she always saw: the steadiness and the depth and the particular quality of attention he gave exclusively to her. "I had a great deal to come home to," he said. "That is an excellent motivator." She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around him, which was not a usual gesture for her in the middle of the day, but which seemed appropriate. He held her with the same steady strength that had characterized him from the beginning, and she felt his heart beating under her ear and was simply grateful, enormously and specifically grateful, for every single improbable turn that had led her to this man and this life. In 1889, Minnie's mother came to visit. She was a small, precise woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, and she looked at Dusty Creek with the expression of someone who had expected to disapprove of something and was finding the grounds for disapproval insufficient. She stayed for a month, and by the end of the first week she was attending council meetings with Minnie and had strong opinions about the road maintenance situation, which she expressed to the relevant parties in a manner that suggested where Minnie had come by her directness. She approved of John, which she communicated by simply treating him as a given, the way you treat things whose quality you have established and do not need to re-examine. She watched him with William and Alina over the course of the visit and said to Minnie privately that she had done well, and she said it in the tone of a woman who knows what she is talking about. "I know," Minnie said. "You were always practical," her mother said, "even as a child, but I sometimes wondered if you would let yourself have what you actually wanted." "So did I," Minnie said honestly. Her mother looked at her for a moment with the complex expression of parents who have raised their children well enough to not need them, which contains pride and something adjacent to grief and something more than either. "You're happy," she said. "Yes," Minnie said, with the simplicity of absolute truth. New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico eventually, though that particular event was still some years away from the autumn of 1889. But the region was changing with a pace that was sometimes exhilarating and sometimes alarming, depending on the day and the direction of the wind. John and Minnie navigated those changes the way they navigated everything together, with clear eyes and complementary strengths, and the bedrock of a partnership that had been built in a crisis and refined in ordinary days, and had proven to be, like the best constructions, stronger under stress than under ease. They had another child, a second son named Robert, in 1890, who arrived on a warm spring morning with considerably more efficiency than his older siblings, as though he had decided not to waste anyone's time, which turned out to accurately predict his personality. He had Minnie's green eyes and John's dark hair, and the particular combination of both their stubbornnesses that made him the most challenging and interesting child in the household, which was, William informed his parents with sisterly solidarity from Alina, saying quite a lot. Mrs. Holt sold the boarding house in 1891 and retired to a smaller house at the edge of town, and Minnie visited her every week without fail, because Mrs. Holt was one of the first people who had been simply kind to her in Dusty Creek, and that was a debt that did not expire. They sat on Mrs. Holt's porch and drank tea and discussed the town with the informed acuity of women who had watched it grow and had opinions about every stage of its growth, and it was one of Minnie's favorite hours of her week. John's dark hair was beginning to show threads of silver in his early 30s, which suited him in the way that things suit people who have the kind of face that age improves. He was the same man he had always been, which was the most significant thing Minnie could say about anyone, that the character she had seen in him in the first weeks in Dusty Creek, steady and honest and quietly devoted, was the same character that was present a decade later, not worn by time but settled more fully into itself. She loved him differently than she had at the beginning. The urgency of the early love, which had been vivid and slightly breathless and conducted against the backdrop of genuine danger, had become something that was no longer urgent because it was no longer in question. It was simply present, threaded through the fabric of every day, the way breath is present, not dramatic but entirely essential. She told him this one evening on the porch in 1892, a decade after she had stepped off a stagecoach in a cloud of orange dust and handed her carpetbag to a tall, serious man with dark eyes who had turned her hat in his hands once. And she had not known then that this was the person. This was the life, but some part of her had known something, had registered something, even in the first minutes. He listened to her describe it the way he always listened completely, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I knew before you did." "That is not true," she said. "Fourth conversation," he said. "I told you." She considered this. What was the fourth conversation? "You came to the office," he said, "and you sat down without being asked, and you told me what you knew as though you had decided to trust me with it without any evidence yet that I deserved it. And I thought that either this was the bravest woman I had ever met or the most foolish, and then I thought it was definitely the former, and then I thought." He stopped. "Then you thought what?" she said. He turned to look at her, and his expression was the one she had seen in the saloon doorway and on their wedding day and the morning their first son was born, unguarded and complete. "Then I thought," he said, "that I was in considerable trouble." She laughed, which she still did often with him, which was one of the things she had not expected and had come to understand was among the greatest gifts of her life. The stars came out over the mesa country the way they always did, in great sweeping numbers that cities would never see, and the night air smelled of juniper and something dry and clean, and the children were inside asleep. And Santos was gone, but there was a new dog, a small brown creature of indeterminate origin that Alina had named Captain, who was asleep on the porch between their chairs. Minnie reached over and found John's hand in the dark, and he took it with the ease of 10 years of practice. His fingers settled around hers with a certainty that had never faltered. She thought about a girl in Boston who had packed 2 leather trunks and stepped toward an uncertain horizon because she had calculated that she was out of options and had been, in the most important sense, entirely wrong. She had had more options than she knew. She had had the option of this man, this house, these children sleeping inside, this town that had taken her in and become hers in the way that places become yours when you have fought for them. She had had the option of a love that had started in a crisis and grown into something that could bear all of ordinary life without diminishing, something that had room in it for arguments about coffee and difficult pregnancies, and the death of dogs and the joy of children and the kind of conversations that went on for a decade and still had not exhausted what there was to say. It was a good life. It was more than good. It was exactly what she had not known to ask for, and she had come to believe that this was the truest form of any happiness, the kind you do not know enough to want until you have somehow, against probability and without a clear plan, arrived inside it. John squeezed her hand once in the darkness. A small thing, a familiar thing, and everything. Thinking, he said. Always, she said. About, he said. She looked at the stars over the mesas of New Mexico, vast and still and astonishing, and thought about all the distances she had traveled to get to this porch, this chair, this hand in hers. About how glad I am, she said. That is all, just how glad I am. He was quiet for a moment, then, me too, he said, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, by any honest accounting, everything.